This is Dutch Fairy Tales for Young Folks. It's a public domain book. It was written in 1918. The Entangled Mermaid. Long ago in Dutch fairyland, there lived a young mermaid who was very proud of her good looks. She was one of a family of mere or lake folks dwelling not far from the sea. Her home was a great pool of water that was half salt and half fresh, for it lay around an island near the mouth of a river. Part of the day, when the sea tides were out, she splashed and played, dived and swam in the soft water of the inland current. When the ocean heaved and salt water rushed in, the mermaid floated and frolicked and paddled to her heart's content. Her father was a gray-bearded merman and very proud of his handsome daughter. He owned an island near the river mouth where the young mermaids held their parties and picnics and received visitors of young mermen. Her mother and two aunts were mere women. All of these were sober folks and attended to the business which occupied all well-brought-up mermaids and mermen. This was to keep their pool nice and clean. No frogs, toads, or eels were allowed near. But in the work of daily house cleaning, the storks and the mermaids were great friends. All water creatures that were not taught to be polite and well-behaved were expected to keep away. Even some silly birds such as loons and screaming and fighting creatures with wings were warned off the premises because they were not wanted. This family of merry folk liked to have nice, quiet time by themselves without any rude folk or on legs or with wings or fins on the outside. Indeed, they wished to make their pool a model for all respectable mermaids and merry men. For 10 leagues around, it was very fun to see the old daddy mermaid with a switch made of reed swishing off the saucy birds, such as the sandpipers and screeching gulls, for the bullfrogs too big for the storks to swallow, and for impudent fish he had a whip made of seaweed. Of course, all the mermaids in good society were welcome, but young mermen were allowed to call only once a month during the week of the full moon. Then the evenings were usually clear, so that when the party broke up, the mermen could see their way in the moonlight to swim home safely with the mermaids' friends, for there were sea monsters that loved to plague the mere folk and even threatened to eat them. The mermaids, dear creatures, had to be escorted home, but they felt safe, for their mer brothers and daddies were so fierce that except for sharks, even the largest fish, such as porpoise and dolphins, were afraid to come near them. One day, Daddy and Mother left to visit some relatives near the island of Yerk. They were to be gone several days. Meanwhile, their daughter was to have a party, her aunts being the chaperones. The mermaids usually held their picnics on an island in the midst of the pool. Here they would sit and sun themselves They talked about the fashions and the prettiest ways to dress their hair. Each one had a pocket mirror, but where they kept these while swimming, no mortal ever found out. They made wreaths of bright color seaweed, orange and black, gray and red, and wore them in their brows like coronets, or they twined them along with the sea berries and bubbles, blossoms among their tresses. Sometimes they made girdles of the strongest and knotted them around their waist. Every once in a while, they chose a queen of beauty for their ruler. Then each of the others pretended to be princesses. Their games and sports often lasted all day and were made very happy. Swimming out in the salt water, the mermaids would go on quest for pearls and corals and other pretty things they would bring to their queen, or with them richly adorn themselves. Thus the mermaid queen and her maidens made a court of beauty that was famed wherever mermaids and mermen lived. They often talked about human maids. "How funny it must be to wear clothes," said one. "Are they cold that they have to keep warm?" It was a little chit of a mermaid whose flippers had barely begun to grow into hands that asked this question. "How can they swim with petticoats on?" asked another. "My brother heard that real men wear wooden shoes." "These must bother them when they're on the water to have their feet floating," said the third, whose name was Silver Scales. "What a pity they don't have flukes like us." And then she looked at her own glistening, scaly coat in admiration. "I can hardly believe it," said a mermaid that was very proud of her fine figure and slender waist. "Their girls can't be half as pretty as we are." "Well, I should like to be a real woman for a while, just to try it and see how it feels to walk on legs," said another, rather demurely, as if afraid the other mermaids might not like her remark. They didn't. Out sounded a lusty chorus. "No, no, horrible! What an idea! Who wouldn't be a mermaid?" "Why, I've heard," cried one, "that real women have to work. Wash their husbands' clothes, milk cows, dig potatoes, scrub floors, and take care of cows. Who would want to be a woman? Not I." She snubbed her nose. Since it could not turn up, grew it wide at the roots. She was sneering at the idea that a creature in petticoats could ever look lovelier than one in shining scales. "Besides," she said, "think of their big noses. And I'm told, too, that girls even have to wear hairpins." At this, the very thought that anyone should have to bind up their tresses, there was a shock of disgust with some, while others clasped their hands, partly in envy and partly in glee. But the funniest thing the mermaids heard of were gloves. They laughed heartily over such things as covers for the fingers. One of the little mermaids used to draw some bag-like seaweed over her hands to see how such things looked. One day, while sunning themselves in the grass on the island, one of their number found a bush on which foxgloves grew. Plucking these, she covered each of her fingers with a red flower. Then, flopping over to the other girls, she held up her gloved hand, half in fright and half in envy. They heard her story. After listening, the party was about to break up when suddenly a merman splashed into view. The tide was running out and the stream low, so he had had hard work to get through the fresh water of the river and to the island. His eyes dropped salt water as if he were crying. He looked tired. While puffing and blowing, he could hardly get out his breath. The queen of the mermaids asked him what he meant by coming among her maids at such an hour and in such a condition. At this, the bashful merman began to blubber. Some of the mere girls put their hands over their mouths to hide their laughing, while they winked at each other, and their eyes showed how they enjoyed the fun. To have a merman among them at this hour in broad daylight and crying was too much for dignity. "Boo-hoo, boo-hoo," said the merman, still weeping saltwater tears as he tried to catch his breath. At last he talked sensibly. He warned the queen that a party of horrid men in wooden shoes with pickaxes, spades, and pumps were coming to drain the swamp and pump out the pool. He had heard they would make the river into a canal and build a dike that should keep out the ocean. "Alas, alas," cried one mermaid, wringing her hands. "Where shall we go when our pool is destroyed? We cannot live in the ocean all the time." Then she wept. The saltwater tears fell from her great round eyes in big drops. "Hush!" cried the queen. "I don't believe the merman's story. He only tells it to frighten us. It's just like him." In fact, the queen suspected that the merman's story was all a sham, and that he had come among her maids with a set purpose to run off with silver scales. She was one of the prettiest mermaids in the company, but very young, vain, and frivolous. It was no secret that she and the merman were in love and wanted to get married. So the queen, without even thanking him, dismissed the swimming messenger. After dinner, the company broke up, and the queen retired to her cave to take a long nap. She was quite tired after entertaining so much company. Besides, since Daddy and Mother were away, there was no beaux to entertain, since it was the dark night and no moon shining on the water. Why need she get up early in the morning? So the mermaid queen slept much longer than ever before. Indeed, it was not till sunset the next day that she awoke. Then, taking her comb and mirror in hand, she started to swim and splash in the pool in order to smooth out her tresses and get ready for supper. But oh, what a change from the day before! What was the matter? All around her things looked different. The water had fallen low, and the pool was nearly empty. The river, instead of flowing, was quiet as a pond. Horrors! When she swam forward, what should she see but a dike and fences? An army of horrid men had come when she was asleep and built a dam. They had fenced around the swamp and were actually beginning to dig slushies to drain the land. Some were at work building a windmill to help in pumping out the water. The first thing she knew, she had bumped her pretty nose against the dam. She thought at once of escaping over the logs and into the sea. When she tried to clamber over the top and get through the fence, her hair got so entangled in the bars that she had to throw away her comb and mirror to try to untangle her tresses. The more she tried, the worse became the tangles. Soon her long hair was all twisted up in the timber. In vain she tried to struggle to escape. She was ready to die with fright when she saw 4 horrid men rushing up to seize her. She attempted to waddle away, but her long hair held her to the post and rails. Her modesty was so dreadfully shocking that she fainted away. When she came to herself, she found she was in a long tub. A crowd of curious little girls and boys were looking at her, for she was on show as a great curiosity. They were bound to see her and get their money's worth in looking, for they had paid a 2 cents admission to the show. Again, before all those eyes, her modesty was so shocked that she gave one groan, flopped over, and was no more. Oh, the poor father and mother at York. When they came back to find their old home gone, unable to get in, they swam out to the sea, never stopping until they reached Spitzbergen. What became of the body of the mermaid queen? Learned men came from Leyden to examine what was now only a specimen and to see how mermaids were made up. Then her skin was stuffed and glass eyes put in where her shining orbs had been. After this, her body was stuffed and mounted in a museum that is set up above a glass case and rested on iron rods. Artists came to Leyden to make pictures of her. No fewer than 9 noblemen copied her pretty form and features in their coat of arms. Instead of Mermaid's Pool is now a cheese farm of 50 cows, a fine house and barn, a family of pink-cheeked, yellow-haired children who walk and play in wooden shoes. So this particular mermaid, all because of her entanglement with a fence, was more famous when stuffed than when living, while her young friend and older relatives were forgotten. All right, Edward, I'm going to use your name in this story, okay? Edward von Brumble was a Dutch boy, 12 years old, who lived where cows were plentiful. He was over 5 feet high, weighed 100 pounds, and had rosy cheeks. His appetite was always good, and his mother declared his stomach had no bottom. His hair was of a color halfway between carrot and sweet potato. It was thick as reeds in the swamp and cut level from under one ear to another. Edward stood in a pair of timber shoes that made an awful rattle when he ran fast to catch a rabbit or scuffled slowly along to school over the brick road of his village. In summer, Klaus was dressed in a robe a rough blue linen blouse. In winter, he wore woolen breeches as wide as coffee bags. They were called bell trousers, and in shapes were like a couple of cowbells turned upward. These were buttoned on to a thick, warm jacket until he was 5 years old. Klaus was dressed like his sisters. Then on his birthday, he had boy clothes with 2 pockets in them, of which he was very proud. Oh, sorry, Edward. I meant to use your name. Edward was a farmer's boy. He had rye bread and fresh milk for breakfast. At dinner time, besides cheese and bread, he was given a plate heaped with boiled potatoes. Into those he first plunged a fork and then dipped each round white ball into a bowl of hot melted butter. Very quickly then did the potato and butter disappear down the red lane. At supper, Edward had bread and skim milk left after the cream had been taken off, with a saucer to make butter. Twice a week, the children enjoyed a bowl of bonny clabber or curd, with little brown sugar sprinkled on top. But at every meal there was cheese, usually in thin slices, which the boy thought not thick enough. When Edward went to bed, he usually fell asleep as soon as his shock of yellow hair touched the pillow. In summer, he slept until the birds began to sing at dawn. In winter, when the bed felt warm and Jack Frost was lively, he often heard the cows talking in their way before he jumped out of his bag of straw, which served as a mattress. The Von Brummels were not rich, but everything was shiny clean. There was always plenty to eat at the Van Brummels' house. Stacks of rye bread, a yard long and thicker than a man's arm, stood on end in the corner of the coal-lined basement. The loaves of dough were put in the oven once a week. Baking time was a great event at the Van Brummels, and no folkmen were allowed in the kitchen on that day unless they were called to help. As the 4 milk pails and pans, filled or emptied, scrubbed or sat in the sun every day to dry, and the cheeses piled up in the pantry, there seemed sometimes enough food to feed a small army. But Edward always wanted more cheese. In other ways, he was a very good boy, obedient at home, always ready to work on the cow farm, and diligent at school. But at the table, he never had enough. Sometimes his father laughed and asked him if he had a well or a cave under his jacket. Edward had 3 younger sisters, Kate, Annie, and Sally. These, their fond mother lovingly called them her orange blossoms. But when at dinner, Edward would keep on dipping his potatoes in hot butter while others were all through, his mother would laugh and call him her buttercup. But always Edward wanted more cheese. When unusually greedy, she twitted him as a boy, worse than butter and eggs, that is, as troublesome as yellow and white plant called toad flax in the farmer's very pretty. but nothing but a weed. One summer's evening, after a good scolding, which he well deserved, Edward mopped and almost cried, went to bed in bad humor. He had teased each one of his sisters to give him her bit of cheese, and this, added to his own slice, made his stomach feel heavy and heavy as lead. Edward's bed was up in the garret. When the house was first built, one of the red tiles of the roof had been taken out and made of glass, and one made of glass was put in its place. In the morning, this gave the boy light to put on his clothes. At night, in fair weather, it supplied air in his room. A gentle breeze was blowing from the pine on the sandy slope not far away, so Edward climbed up on the stool to sniff the sweet piney odors. He thought he saw lights dancing under the tree. One beam seemed to approach his roof hole, and coming nearer, played around the chimney. Then it passed to and fro in front of him. It seemed to whisper in his ear as it moved by, but it looked very much as if 100 fireflies had united their cold light into one lamp. Then Edward thought that these strange beams were the shape of a lovely girl, but he only laughed at himself for this idea. Pretty soon, however, he thought the whispers became a voice. Again he laughed heartily, that he forgot his moping and the scolding his mother had given him. In fact, his eyes twinkled with delight when the voice gave its invitation. There's plenty of cheese. Come with us. To make sure of it, the sleepy boy now rubbed his eyes and cocked his ears. Again the light bearer spoke. Come. Could it be? He had heard old people tell of the ladies of the wood that whispered and warned travelers. In fact, he himself had often seen the fairy rings in the pine woods. To this, the flame lady was inviting him. Again and again, the moving cold light circled around the red tile roof, which the moon, then rising and peeping over the chimney, seemed to turn to silver. As the dais rose higher in the sky, he could hardly see the moving lights that had looked like a lady, but the voice, no longer a whisper as at first, now even plainer. There's plenty of cheese. Come with us. I'll see what it is anyhow, said Edward, as he drew on his thick woolen socks and prepared to go downstairs and out without waking a soul. At the door, he stepped into his wooden shoes. Just then the cat purred and rubbed up against his shins. He jumped, for he was scared, but looked down. For a moment he saw 2 balls of yellow fire in her head and knew what they were. Then he spied the pine woods and towards the fairy ring. What an odd sight! At first Edward thought it was a circle of big fireflies, but then he saw clearly there were dozens of pretty creatures, hardly as large as dolls, but as lively as crickets. They were full of light, as if lamps had wings. Hand in hand, they flitted and danced around the rings of grass as if it was fun. Hardly had Edward gotten over his first surprise, then all of a sudden he felt himself surrounded by the fairies. Some of the strongest among them had lifted the main party of the circle to come to him. He felt himself pulled by their dainty fingers. One of them, the loveliest of all, whispered in his ear, "Come, you must dance with us." Then a dozen of the pretty creatures surrounded and murmured in chorus, "Plenty of cheese here, plenty of cheese here. Come on, come on." Upon this, the heels of Edward seemed to light as a feather. In a moment, with both hands clasped in those of the fairies, he was dancing in high glee. It was much fun, as if he were at a party with rows of boys and girls, hand in hand, swinging along the streets as Dutch maids and youth do during the Kermish week. Kermish, I don't know. Edward had not time to look hard at the fairies, for he was too full of fun. He danced and danced all night until the skies in the east began to turn first gray and then rosy. Then he tumbled down, tired out, and fell asleep. His head lay on the inner curve of the fairy ring with his feet in the center. Edward was very happy, for he had no sense of being tired. He did not know he was asleep. He thought his fairy partners, who had danced with him, were now waiting on him to bring him cheese. With a golden knife, they sliced them off and fed him out of their own hands. How good it tasted! He thought now he could and would eat all the cheese he longed for. All his life, there was no mother to scold him or daddy to shake a finger at him. How delightful! But by and by, he wanted to stop eating and rest for a while. His jaw was tired. His stomach seemed loaded with cannonballs. He gasped for breath. But the fairies wouldn't let him stop, for Dutch fairies never get tired. Flying out of the sky from the north, south, east, and west they came, bringing cheese. These they dropped down around him until the piles of round masses threatened first to enclose him as with a wall, then to overtop him. There were the red balls from Edmund, the pink and yellow spheres from Gouda, the gray loaf-shaped ones from Leyden, down through the vista of sand in the pine woods. He looked, and oh, horrors! There was the tallest and strongest of the fairies rolling along the huge round flats of cheese from Friesland. Any of these were as big as a cartwheel and would feed a regiment. The fairies trundled the heavy discs along as if they were playing with hoops. They shouted hilariously as with pine sticks they beat them forward like boys at play. Farm cheese, factory cheese, Alkmaar cheese, and 2 crowns all. Cheese from Limburg, which Edward never could bear because of its strong odor. Soon the cakes and balls were heaped so high around him that the boy, as he looked up, felt like a frog in a well. He groaned. He thought the high cheese wall were tottering to fall on him. Then he screamed, but the fairies thought he was making music. They, not being human, did not know how a boy feels. At last, with thick slice in one hand and a huge chunk in the other, he could eat no more cheese. Though the fairies, led by their queen, standing on one side or hovering above his head, all urged him to take more. At this moment, while afraid that he would burst, Edward saw the pile of cheese, as big as a house, topple over. The heavy mass fell inward upon him. With a scream of terror, he thought himself crushed as flat as the Friesland cheese, but he wasn't. Waking up and rubbing his eyes, he saw the red sun rising on the sand dunes. Birds were singing, and the roosters were crowing all around him in a chorus of if saluting him. Just then, the village rooster chimed out the hour of the village clock, He felt his clothes. They were wet with dew. He sat up and looked around. There were no fairies, but in his mouth was a bunch of grass, which he'd been chewing lustily. Edward never would tell the story of that night with the fairies, nor has he yet settled the question whether they left him because the cheese house of his dreams had fallen, or because daylight had come. Alone, the princess with 20 petticoats. I think I'm going to wear a skirt tomorrow. Long ago, before even the blue flax flower bloomed in Holland, and when Dutch mothers wore wolfskin clothes, there was a little princess, very much beloved by her father, who was a great king and war chief. She was very pretty and fond of seeing herself. There were no metal mirrors in those days, nor any looking glass. So she went into the woods, and before the pool and the deep, quiet water courses made reflections of her own lovely face. Of this pleasure she never seemed weary, yet sometimes this little princess was very naughty. Then her temper was not nearly so sweet as her face. She would play in the sand and roll around in the woods among the leaves and bushes until her curls were all tangled up. And when her nurse combed out her hair with a stone comb, for no other kind were then known, she would fret and scold and often stomp her foot. When very angry, she called her nurse or governess a roach, a big beast-like buffalo. At this, the maid put up her hand to her face. Horrible! Then she would feel her forehead to see if horns were growing there. The nurse, they called her governess, as the years went on, grew tired of the behavior of the young princess. Sometimes she went and told her mother how naughty her daughter was, even calling her a roach. Then the little girl only showed her bad temper worse. She rolled among the leaves all the more and mussed up her ringlets so that the governess could hardly comb them out smooth again. It seemed useless to punish the little maid by boxing her ears, pinching her arm, or giving her a good spanking. They even tried to improve her temper by taking away her dinner, but it did no good. Then the governess and the mother went together to the father. When they complained of his daughter to the king, he was much worried. He could fight strong men with his club and spear, and even giants with his sword and battle axe. But how to correct his little daughter, whom he loved as his own eyes, was too much for him. He had no son, and the princess was his only child, and the hopes of the family all rested on her. The king wondered how he would govern his people after he should die if she became the queen. Yet he was glad for one thing, that with all her naughtiness, she was like her father. always kind to animals. Her pet was a little roach calf. Some hunters had killed the mother of the poor thing in the winter time, so the princess kept the creature warm and fed it out of her hand daily. It was in gloom and with a sad face that the king walked into the woods, thinking how to make a sweet-tempered lady out of his petulant daughter, who was fast growing up to be a tall, fine-looking woman. Now, when the king had been himself a little boy, he was very kind to all living creatures, wild and tame, dumb and with voice, yes, even to the trees in the forest. When a prince, the boy would never let the axeman cut down an oak until they first begged pardon of the fairy that lived in the tree. There was one big oak especially, which was near the mansion of his father the king. It was said that the doctor found little babies in its leafy branches and brought them to their mothers. The prince boy took great care of this tree. He was taught by a wise man to cut off the dead limbs, keep off the worms, and warn away all people seeking to break its branches, even for Yuletide, which came at our Christmas time. Once, when some hunters had chased a young she-roach with her 2 calves into the king's park, the prince thought he was only then a little boy. The prince, though he was only, ran out and drove the rough fellows away. Then he sheltered and fed the roach family of 3 until they were fresh and fat. After this, he sent a skilled hunter to intimate the sound of the roach mother, to call the roach father to the edge of the woods. He then let them all go free and was happy to see the dumb brutes frisking together. Now that the boy prince was grown to a man and had long been king, he had forgotten all about the incidents of his early years. He was one day walking in the forest. Suddenly, a gentle breeze arose, and the leaves of the old oak tree began first to rustle and then to whisper. Soon the words were clear, and the spirit of the oak said, I've seen 1,000 years pass by since I was an acorn planted here. In a few moments I shall die and fall down. Cut my body into staves. Of these make a wooden petticoat like a barrel for your daughter. When her temper is bad, put it on and wear it until she promises to be good. The king was sad as he thought of losing the grand old tree under which he had played as a boy and his father before him. His countenance fell. Cheer up, my friend, said the oak, for something better shall follow. When I pass away, you will find on the spot a blue flower growing. Where the forest was shall be fields on which the sun shines. Then, if your daughter be good, young women shall spin something prettier than wooden petticoats. Watch for the blue flower. Moreover, added the voice of the tree, that I may not be forgotten, do not take henceforth as your family name. Oh, do you take henceforth as your family names? 10 Oaks. At this moment, the huge roach rushed into the wood. Its long hair and shaggy mane were gray with age. The king, thinking the beast would lower its horn and charge at him, drew his sword to fight the mighty brute that seemed to weigh well nigh a ton. But the roach stopped within 10 feet of the king and bellowed. But in a minute or two, the bellowing changed to a voice, and the king heard these good words: "I die with the oak, for we are brothers, kept under an enchantment for 1,000 years, which is to end in a few moments. Neither a tree nor a roach can forget your kindness to us. When you were a prince, as soon as our spirits are released and we go back to our home in the moon, saw off my right horn and make it a comb to use for your daughter's curls. It will be smoother than a stone." In a moment, a tempest arose, which drove the king for shelter behind some rocks hard by. After a few minutes, the wind ceased and the sky was clear. The king looked, and there lay the oak fallen at full length, and the roaches lay lifeless beside it. Just then the king's woodmen, who were out thinking their master might be hurt, drew near. He ordered them to take out the right horn of the roach and split it part of the oak for staves. The next day they made a wooden petticoat and a horn comb. They were such novelties that nearly every woman in the kingdom came to see them. After this, the king called himself Lord of the Land of 10 Oaks, and ever after this was his family name, which all his descendants bore. Whenever the princess showed her temper, she was forced to wear the wooden petticoat. To have boys and girls point at her and make fun of her was severe punishment. But a curious thing took place. It was found that every time the maid combed the hair of the princess, she became gentler and sweeter tempered. She often thanked her governess and said she liked having her curls smooth with the new comb. She even begged her father to let her own one and have a comb all to herself. It was not long before she surprised her governess and her parents by combing and curling her own hair. In truth, such a wonderful change came over the princess that she did not often have to wear the wooden petticoat after a year or two, not at all. Soon the gossips nearly forgot all about it. One summer day, the princess was walking in the open sunny space where the oak had stood. She saw a blue flower. It seemed as beautiful as it was strange. She plucked it and put it in her hair. When she reached home, her old aunt, who had been in the southern lands, declared it to be the flower of flax. Thank you, Eddie, for sending me my flax flower. During the spring, millions of tiny green blades sprang up where the forest had been, and when summer came, the plants were half a yard high. The women learned how to pull the stalks, put the stalks in water, and root the coarse outer fibers of the flax. Then they took the silk-like strands from the inside and spun them in their spinning wheels. Then they wove them into pretty cloths. This, when they laid out on the grass under the sunshine, was bleached white. The flax thread was made first into linen and then into lace. Let us name the place Greenfield. The happy people cried when they saw how green the earth was where they had been the dark forest. So the place was ever after called Greenfield. Now, when the princess saw what pretty clothes the Snow White linen made, she invented a new style of dress. The upper garment, or rook, is the one above the waist she now called bovenbroek, and the lower one beneath her waist. In Dutch, bovenbroek and beneath means beneath. Doven means above and beneath means beneath. By and by, when at the loom more of the beautiful light white linen was woven, she had a new petticoat made of it and put it on. She was so delighted with this one that she wanted more. One after another, she belted them around her waist until she had on 20 petticoats at a time. Proud she was of her skirts, even though they made her look like a barrel. When her mother and maids and all the women of Greenfield, young and old, saw that the princess set the fashion, they all followed. It was not always easy for the poor girl who were to be married to buy as many as 20 petticoats, but as it was the fashion, every bride had to obey the rule. It grew to be a custom to have at least 20, for only this number is thought proper. So, a new rule, even among men, grew up. A betrothed young man or his female relatives assisting him was accompanied to make a present of one or more petticoats to his sweetheart to increase her wardrobe. Thus the fashion prevailed and still holds. Among the women of the coast, fat or thin, tall or short, they pile on petticoats and swing their skirts proudly as they walk or go to the market to sell their fish, crying fresh herring in the streets, or to their knitting at home or in front of their houses. In some parts of the country, nothing makes a girl so happy as to present her with a new petticoat. It is the fashion to have the figure like a barrel and wear one's clothes so as to look like a small hedgehog. By and by, the men built a dam to get plenty of water in winter for the rotting of the flax stalks. The linen industry made the people rich. In time, a city sprang up, which they called Rotterdam, or the dam where they rotted the flax. And because where had been the forest of oaks with the pool and rivets was now a silvery stream flowing gently between meadows, they made the arms and seal of the city green and white, 2 of the former and 1 of the latter. This is verde and silver. To this day, on the arms and flags of the great city and on the high smokestacks of the mighty steamers that come across the ocean from land to land, one sees wide white band between 2 broad stripes of green. The cat and the cradle. In the early ages, when our far-off ancestors lived in the woods, ate acorns, slept in caves, and dressed in skins of wild animals, they had no horses, cows, or cats. Their only pets and helpers were dogs. The men and the dogs were more like each other than they are now. However, they knew about bees, so the women gathered honey and from it made mead. Not having any sugar, the children enjoyed tasting honey more than anything else, and it was the only sweet thing they had. By and by, cows were brought into the country, and the Dutch soil being good for grass, the cows had plenty to eat. When the animals multiplied, the people drank milk and learned to make cheese and butter. So the Dutch boys and girls grew fat and healthy. The oxen were so strong they could pull logs of wood or draw a plow. So little by little, the forests were cut down and grassy meadows full of bright colored flowers took their place. Houses were built and the people were rich and happy. Yet there were still many cruel men and bad people in the land. Sometimes, too, floods came and drowned the cattle and covered the fields with sand or salt water. In such times, food was very scarce. Thus it happened that not all the babies born could live, or every little child be fed. The baby girls especially were often left to not survive, because war was common and only boys that grew into strong warriors were wanted. It grew to be custom that families would hold a council and decide whether the baby should be raised or not. But if anyone should give the infant even a tiny drop of milk or food of any kind, it was allowed to live and grow up. If no one gave it milk or honey, it passed. No matter how much a mother might love her baby, she was not allowed to put milk to its lips if the grandmother or elders forbade it. The young bride coming into her husband's home always had to obey his mother, for she was now as a daughter and one of the family. They all lived together in one house, and the grandmother ruled all of the women and girls that lived under one roof. This was the way of the world when our ancestors were pagans and not always as kind to little babies as our own mothers and fathers are now. Many times was the old grandmother angry when her son had taken a wife and a girl was born. If the old woman expected a grandson who should grow up and be a fighter with a sword and spear, and it turned out to be a girl, she was mad as fire. Often the pretty bride brought into the house had a hard time of it with her husband's mother if she did not in time have a baby boy. In those days, a Herman or war man and German were one and the same word. Now, when the good missionaries came into Friesland, one of the first of the families to receive the gospel was one named Alfred, with his bride who became a Christian. Alfred helped the missionaries to build a church. By and by, a sweet little baby was born in the family, and the parents were very happy. They loved the little thing, as fathers and mothers love their children now. But when someone went and told the grandmother that the new baby was a girl instead of a boy, the old woman flew into a rage and would have gone at once to get hold of the baby and put it into the earth. Her lameness, however, made her move slowly, and she could not find her crutch, for the midwife, who knew the bad temper of the grandmother, had purposely hid it. The old woman was angry because she did not want any more females in the big house where she thought there were already too many. Food was hard to get, and there was not enough war men to defend the tribe. She meant to get the new baby and give it to the wolves. The old grandmother was a pagan and still worshipped the cruel gods that loved fighting. She did not like the new religion because it taught gentleness and peace. But the midwife, who was a neighbor, feared that the old woman was malicious and she had hid her crutch. This she did so that if the baby was a girl, she could save its life. The midwife was a good woman who had been taught that the great Creator loves little girls as well as boys. So when the midwife heard the grandmother storm and rave while hunting for her crutch, she ran first to the honey jar and dipped her forefinger in it and put some drops of honey on the baby's tongue. Then she passed it out the window to some women's friends who were waiting outside. She knew the law that if the child tasted food, she must be allowed to live. The kind woman took the baby to their home and fed it carefully. A hole was drilled in the small end of a cow's horn, and the warm milk, fresh from the cow, was allowed to fall drop by drop into the baby's mouth. In a few days, the little one was able to suckle its breakfast slowly out of the horn while one of the girls held it. So the baby grew bigger every day. All the time it was carefully hidden. The foolish grandmother was foiled, for she could never find out where the baby girl was, which all the time was growing strong and plump. Her father secretly made her a cradle, and he and the babe's mother came often to see their child. Everyone called her Little Honey. Now, about this time, cats were brought into the country, and the children made such pets of them that some of the cows seemed to be jealous of the attention paid to the cats and the kittens. These were the days when cows and people all lived under one long roof. The children learned to tell the time of day, whether it was morning, noon, or night, by looking into the cat's eyes. They seemed to open and shut very much as if they had doors. A fat cat, which was brought into the house where Little Honey was, seemed to be very fond of the little girl, and the two, the cat and the child, played much together. It was often said that the cat loved the baby even more than her own kittens. Everyone called the affectionate animal by the nickname which meant Little Double, because this cat was twice as loving as most cats' mothers are. When her first furry little babies were young, she carried them from one place to another in her mouth. But this way of holding kittens she never tried on the baby. She seemed to know better. Indeed, Little Double often wondered why human babies were born so naked and helpless, for at an age when her kittens could feed themselves and run about and play with their tails and catch each other, Little Honey was not yet able to crawl. But other dangers were in store for the little girl. One day, when the men were out hunting and the women went into the woods to gather nuts and acorns, a great flood came. The waters washed away the house so that everything floated into the great river and down towards the sea. What would become of our baby? So thought the parents of Little Honey when they came back to find their house swept away and no sign of their little daughter. Little Double and her kittens and all the cows were gone too. Now it happened that when the flood came and the house crashed down, Baby was sound asleep. The cat, leaving its kittens that were now pretty well grown up, leapt up and onto the top of the cradle and floated, and the two floated off together. Pretty soon they found themselves left alone with nothing in sight that was familiar except for one funny thing. That was a wooden shoe in which was a fuzzy little yellow chicken, hardly 4 days old. It had been playing in the shoe when the floods came and swept it off from under the very beak of the old hen that with all her other chicks was speedily drowned. On and on the raging flood bore baby and kitty until night came down. For hours more they drifted until, happily, the cradle was swept into an eddy in front of a village. There it spun round and round, and might have soon bore into the great flood, which seemed to roar louder as the water rose. Now a cat can see sometimes in the night, better even in the day, for the darker it becomes, the wider open the eyes of the cat. In bright sunshine at noon, the inside doors of the cat's eyes close to narrow slits, while at night these doors open wide. That is the reason why, in the days before clocks, the watches were made. The children could tell about the time of day by looking into cats' eyes. Sometimes they named their cat Clogs, which means clock eyes, or bell eyes, for bell clocks are older than clocks with a dial, and because in Holland the bells rings out the hour and past quarter hours. Cats looked up and saw the church towers looming up in the dark. At once she began to meow and caterwaul with all her might. She hoped that someone in the houses near the riverbank might catch the sound, but none seemed to hear or heed. At last, when Kitty was nearly exhausted with howling, a light appeared at one of the windows. This showed that someone was up and moving. It was a boy who was named Derek, after Saint Theodoric, who had first long ago built a church in the village. Then Kitty opened her mouth and lungs again and set up a regular cat scream. This awakened all her other relatives in the village, and every Tom and Kitty made answer until there was a cat concert of meows and caterwauls. The boy heard, rushed downstairs, opened his door, listened. The wind blew out his candle, but the brave lad was guided by the sound which the cat made. Reaching the bank, he threw off his wooden clumps, plunged into the boiling waters, and seized the cradle, towing it ashore. Then he woke up his mother and showed her his prize. The way the baby laughed and crowed and patted the horn of milk and kicked up its toes in delight over the warm milk which was brought was a joy to see. Near the hearth in the middle of the floor, little Double, the kitty, was given some straw for a bed, and after purring joyfully, was soon, like the baby, sound asleep. Thus the cat warned the boy, and the boy saved the baby. That was very welcome in a family where there were no girls but only a boy. When little Honey grew up to be a young woman, she looked as lovely as a princess, and in the church was married to Derek. It was the month of April, and all the world was waking to flowers when the wedding procession came out of the church. The air was sweet with opening of the buds. Before the next New Year's Day arrived, there lay in the same cradle and put to sleep over the same rockers a baby boy. When they brought him to the front, the good grandmother named him Lud something. He grew up to be a great missionary, whose name in Friesland is, even today, after 1,000 years, a household word. He it was who drove out bad fairies, vile enchanters, wicked spirits, and terrible diseases. Best of all, he banished eye-bite, which was the name people gave to witchcraft. Also made it hard for the naughty elves and spirits to delude men. After this, it was easy for the good spirits that lived in the kind hearts and noble lives to multiply and prosper. The wolves were driven away or killed off and became very few, while the cattle and sheep multiplied until everybody could have a woolen coat, and there was a cow to every person in the land. But the people still suffered from floods that from time to time drowned the cattle and human beings, and the ebb tides that carried everything out to sea. Then the good missionary taught the men how to build dikes that kept out the ocean and made the water of the rivers stay between the banks. The floods became fewer and fewer, and at last rarely happened. Then Santa Claus arrived to keep alive in the hearts of people the spirit of love and kindness and good cheer forever. At last, when nearly 100 years had passed away, little Honey, once the baby girl, and then the dear old lady who was kind to everybody and prepared the way for Santa Claus, passed. Then also little Double the cat, that had 9 lives, passed with her. They buried the old lady under the church floor and stuffed the cat that everybody, kittens, boys and girls, and people loved. By and by, when the cat's tail and fur fell to pieces, the ears tumbled off, its glass eyes dropped out. A skillful artist chiseled a statue of little Double, which still stands over the tomb in the church. Every year on Santa Claus Day, December 6th, the children put a new collar around its neck and talk about the cat that saved a baby's life, Prince Spinhead and Miss Snow White. Long ago, before the Romans came into the land, when the fairies ruled in the forest, there was a maiden who lived under an old oak tree. When she was a baby, they called her Pumpkin. She had 4 brothers who loved their younger sister very dearly and did everything they could to make her happy. Her fat father was a famous hunter. When he roamed the woods, no bear, wolf, or roebuck, deer, or big animal of any kind could escape his spear or his pit traps. He taught his sons to be skillful in the chase, but also to be kind to the dumb creatures when captured, especially when the mother beast was captured. The boys were always told to care for the cubs, whelps, and kittens. As for the smaller animals, foxes, hares, weasels, rabbits, or ermine, these were so numerous that the father left the business of hunting them to the lads, who had great sport. The house under the oak tree was always well provided with meat and furs. The 4 brothers brought the little animals, which they took in the woods to make presents to their sister. There was always plenty of pets: bears, wolf cubs, wild cats, kittens, baby roach, and for the girl to play with. Every day, while the animals were so young as to be fed on milk, she enjoyed frolicking with the 4-footed babies. When they grew bigger, she romped with them as if she and they were equal members of the same family. The older brothers watched carefully so that the little brutes, as they increased in size, shouldn't bite or claw his sister, for he knew the fierce nature that was in the wild creatures. Yet the maiden had wonderful powers over these beasts of the forest. Whether little or big, she was not very much afraid of them, and often made them run by looking at them hard in the eyes. While the girl made a pet of the animals, her parents made a pet of her. The mother prepared the skin of the wolves and bears until they were very soft, keeping the fur on to make the rugs for the floor, the winter coats for her children, the hides stuffed for rougher use. But from what had once been the clothes of the fawn, the weasel, the rabbit, and the ermine, garments were made that were smooth enough to suit a baby's tender flesh. The forest folk wrapped their infants in swaddling bands made of these dressed pelts. After feeding the darling, the mother hugged her baby up, warmly covered to a tree branch. The cradle was a furry bag, was made of the same material, and swung in the wind. Bumblekin usually fell asleep right after she had her breakfast. When she woke up crowing, the squirrels were playing all around her. She even learned to watch the spiders spinning their homes of silk without being afraid. When Bumblekin grew up, she always called this curious creature that could make silk Spinhead. She jokingly called it her lover in remembrance of baby days. It was funny to see how deft the mother was with her needles, fashioned from bone, and her rough thread, which was made of the intestines of the deer. From her own childhood in the woods, Bumblekin's mother had been used to the kind of dressmaking. Now, when her daughter had grown from babyhood and through her teens to be a lovely maiden, fair of face and strong of limb, her sweet, unselfish parents was equal to a new task. To the soft leather coats made from the skins of fawns, martens, and weasels, she added trims of snow-white ermine. Capes and mittens, cloaks for the body, and coverings for the feet were fashioned to fit. Fringes here and there were put on them until the girl looked like the king's daughter. In summer, the skins of birds and their feathers clothed her lightly, and with many and rich colors, the forest flowers decked her hair. In winter, her white forest robes, the maiden, except for her rosy face and sparkling eyes, seemed as if she might have been born of the snow, or was the daughter of the northern ice god. And because she was so lovely, her parents changed her baby name and called her Snow White. Yet, though no other girl in Glenderland equaled, and none, not even the princess, excelled Snow White in beauty of face, form, or raiment, the maiden was not happy. Even though many lovers came to her and offered to marry her, some, as proof of their skills as hunters, brought the finest furs and forest furnished. Others showed their strength or fleetness of foot. Some bargained with kabouters or fairies of the mines to bring them shining ore or precious gems which they offered to Snow White. Others again went afar to get strange wonders, amber, or from the seashores of the far north, seahorses to please her. One fine fellow who had been in the south and was proud of his travels told her what he had seen in the great cities and offered her a necklace of pearls. But all was in vain. Every lover went away sorrowful, for Snow White wearied of them and sent each one home disappointed. Long at last, among the lovers came a strange-looking one named Spinhead, resembling a spider, promising a secret worth more than furs, gold, gems, or necklace. But the mother, seeing the ugly creature, drove it off with a hard word. So the months and years passed, until her father feared he would not live to see his daughter a wife. But one day, when the household were absent, the leaves of the oak tree rustled loudly. There was no wind, and Snow White, surprised, strained her ears to find out what this might mean. Soon she could make out these words: "When the spider that you called Spinhead comes to make love to you, listen to him. He is the wisest being in the forest. He knows the future. He will tell you a secret. I shall pass away, but what he teaches, you shall live." And then the leaves of the oak ceased to rustle, and all was quiet again still. While wondering what this strange message might mean, down came the real spider she had named Spinhead. He lowered himself from a tree branch high above on a silken thread. The creature sat down on the log beside the maiden, but she was not the least bit startled and did not scream or run away. Indeed, she spoke to the spider as an old friend. "Well, playmate of my babyhood, what have you to tell me? I came to offer you my love. You need not marry me yet, but if you will let me spin a web in your room, I shall live there. By and by reward you. Let me be in your sight always, and you will not be sorry for it." The maiden had no sooner agreed than a terrible tempest rooted the oak and leveled the trees of the forest. In a moment more, a new and very beautiful house rose up out of the ground. It was as noble as a palace. Nearby was a garden, and one day she walked in it. Out of it sprang a blue flower almost under her feet. "Choose the best room for yourself," said Spinhead, "and then show me my corner. After 100 days, if you treat me kindly, I shall reveal the secret of the blue flower." Snow White, the maiden, chose the sunniest room and gave Spinhead the best corner near the window and close to the ceiling. At once he began to weave a shining web for his own house. She wondered what such fine work no human weaver could excel, and why she was not able to spin silk out of her head, nor even with her fingers, like her strange lover. But the oak had promised that Spinhead would reveal a secret, and she was curious what that secret was. Like all little girls, she was in a hurry to have the secrets. Snow White looked on while Spinhead was thus busy at making his dwelling place with shining threads which spun out ever ceasingly. She was so intent upon watching him that night came down before she noticed that her room was not furnished. There was not even a bed to sleep on. Spinhead looked at her closely and then spoke with a deep voice like a man. "Ah, I know you want a bed and pretty things for your room." In another moment, soft furs lined the floor, and soon all of Snow White had possessed in the forest for comfort. She had now more. Lost in wonder as she was, in a few minutes she was fast asleep. She dreamed she wore a dress of some strange, new white fabric, such as her people never had before seen. Instead of being close in texture like the skin of an animal, it was open work, full of thousands of little holes, yet strongly held together. It was light and gauzy, like the silvery spider web on the summer grass. Before sunrise, when the pearly it's pearly with dewdrops, the 100 days passing swiftly by, and Spinhead and Snow White became fast friends. Each lived in a different world, a world within a world. She was waiting for the secret he had to tell her. She bravely resolved not to be impatient, but let Spinhead speak first. One day, when autumn had come, she was lonely. She sauntered out into the garden. The chill winds were blowing and the leaves falling till they covered the ground like a yellow carpet. One fell into her hand as if it bore words of friendly greeting. Yet though she waited, not one of the million of them brought a message to her. Never a word had she ever heard from her parents or brothers. The blue flower had long ago fallen away. There was nothing in its place but a hard, rough, black stalk. Then she said to herself, "Is there anything in this ugly stick? How will Spinhead reveal its secret? Never had she been so cast down." Again the tempest howled. All the winds of heaven seemed to break loose. Many a sturdy oak lay prostrate. The leaves darkened the air so that Snow White could see nothing. Then there was a great calm. The maid cleared her sight, and lo, there beside her stood a youth, more beautiful than any of her brothers or her lovers or any man she had ever seen. He was dressed in fine white cloth, excelling in its texture any skin of a fawn or animal of the forest. Instead of being leather, however soft, it seemed to be woven of a multitude of threads. In his hand he held the black stalk of what had been the blue flower. "I am Spinhead," he said. "The 100 days are over. The spell is broken, and my deliverance from enchantment has come. I bring to you as my gift this ugly stalk on which the blue flower bloomed." Between surprise at the change of Spinhead from a spider to a handsome youth, and disappointment at such a present offered her, Snow White was dumb. She could hardly draw her breath. "Was that all?" "Break it open," said Spinhead. Splitting the stalk from end to end, the maiden was surprised to find inside many long, silky fibers, almost as fine as the strands in the spider's web. She pulled them out, and her eyes danced with joy. Plant the seeds and let the blue flowers blossom by millions, said the youth, and gather the stalks, and from the fibers weave them together and make this. The black robe is a scepter of wealth. Then, separating the delicate strands one by one, Spinhead wove them together. The result was a rich robe of snow-white fabric, never seen in the forest. It was linen. Snow White clapped her hands with joy. This for your wedding dress, if you will marry me, said Spinhead. Snow White's cheeks blushed red, but she looked at him with her eyes and said yes. Wait, said Spinhead, I will make your bridal veil. Once more, his fingers wrought wonders. He produced yards of gauzy openwork stuff. He made it float in the air first, then he threw it over her head. It trailed down her back and covered her rosy face. It was lace. Happily married, they left the forest and traveled to the land where the blue flax flowers made a new sky on earth. Soon, on the map, men read the names of cities unknown before, at a time when Europe had no such masses of happy people, joyous in their toils. What the blue flower of flax had done for the country, more than gold, gems, or wealth of the forest or mines, was the gift of Spinhead to Snow White for making the land fun. The boar with the golden bristles. Long, long ago were brave fighters and skillful hunters in Holland, but neither men nor women ever dreamed that food was to be got out of the ground, but only from trees and bushes such as berries, acorns, and honey. They thought the crust of the earth was too hard to be broken up for seed, even if they knew what grain and bread were. They supposed that what nature provided in the forest was the only food for men. Besides this, they made their women do all the work and cook the acorns and brew the honey into meat, while they went out and fish and hunt and fight. So the fairies took pity on the cold northern people who lived where it rained and snowed a great deal. They held a council and agreed it was time to send down to earth an animal with tusks to tear up the ground. Then the people would see the riches of the earth and learn what the soil was. They would be blessed with farms and gardens, barns and stalls, hay, grains, horses, cattle, wheat, barley, pigs, and clothes. Now, there were powerful fairies of a certain kind who lived in a happy land far away, who had charge of everything in the air and water. One of them, named Fro, who became the lord of summer, sunshine, and warm showers that make all things grow, was in this bright region that the white elves lived. It was a pretty custom in fairyland that when a fairy baby cut its first tooth, the mother's friend should make the little one some pretty presents. When Nithras, the mother of the infant Fro, looked into his mouth and saw the little white thing that had come up through the baby's gums, she went in great glee and told the glad news to all the other fairies. It was a great event, and she tried to guess what presents her wonderful baby boy should receive. There was a giant-like fairy as strong as a polar bear who agreed to get Fro for a creature that could put his nose under the sod and root up the ground. In this way, he would show the men of the earth what just under the surface contained, without their going into mines and caverns. One day, this giant fairy heard two stout dwarfs talking loudly in the region under the earth. They were boasting as to which could beat the other in the fire and bellows, for both were blacksmiths. One was the king of the dwarfs, who made a bet that he could excel the other. So he set them to work as rivals, with the third dwarf working the bellows. The dwarf king threw some gold in the flames to melt, but fearing he might not win the bet, he went away to get other fairies to help him. He told the bellows dwarf to keep on pumping air on the fire, no matter what might happen to him. So when one giant fairy in the form of a gadfly flew at him and bit him in the hand, the bellow blower did not stop for the pain, but kept on until the fire roared loudly as to make the cavern echo. Then all the gold melted and could be transformed. As soon as the dwarf king came back, the bellows blower took up the tongs and drew out of the fire a boar having golden bristles. This fire-born golden boar had the power of traveling through the air as swiftly as a streak of lightning. Its name was Gullin, or Golden, and was given to the fairy Fro. And he, when grown, used the wonderful creature as his steed. All the other good fairies and elves rejoiced because the men on earth would now be helped to do great things. Even more wonderful to tell, his fire-born creature became the father of all the animals that have tusks that roam the woods. A tusk is a big tooth of which the hardest and the sharpest parts grow long and sharp outside of the mouth, and it stays there even when the mouth is shut. When Gullin was not occupied or being ridden by Fro on his errands over the world, he taught his sons, that is, the wild boars of the forest, how to root up the ground and make it soft for things to grow in. Then his master Fro sent the sunbeam and warm showers to make the turned up earth fruitful. To do this, the wild boars were given two long tusks, as pointed as needles and sharp as knives. With one sweep of his head, the boar could rip open a dog or a wolf, a bull or a bear, or furrow the earth like a plowshare. Now, there are several cousins in the tusked family: the elephant on land, the walrus, the narwhal in the seas, but none of these could plow ground. But because the boar's tusks grew out so long and were so sharp and hooked at the end, it could tear open the earth's hard crust and root up the ground. This made a soil fit for tender plants to grow. Even in the wild, flowers sprung up in them. All this, when they first noticed it, was very wonderful to human beings. The children called one to the other to come and see the unusual sight. The little troughs, made first by the ripping of the boar's tusk, or widened by rooting with their snouts. These were welcomed by the birds, for they hopped into the lines, thus to feed on worms. So the birds, supposing that these little gutters in the ground were made especially for them, made great friends with the boars. They even perch near by or fly to their backs and ride on them. As for the men fathers, when they looked at the clods and loose earth thus turned over, they found them to be very soft. So the women and girls were able to break them up with their sticks. Then the seeds dropped by the birds that came flying back every springtime from faraway lands sprouted. It was noticed that a new kind of plant grew up, which had stalks, and the heads or ears of those were 100-fold more seed. When the children tasted them, they found to their delight that these little grains were good to eat. They swallowed them whole, they roasted them at fire, or they pounded them with stone. Then they baked the meal, or thus made it into mush, eating it with honey. For the first time, people in the Dutch world had bread. When they added honey brought by the bees, they had a sweet cake with mead. Then, saving the seeds over from one summer to another, they in the springtime planted them in the little trenches made by the animals' tusks. Then the Dutch word for boar and row are now put together, meaning boar-row, and there issued in time our word for row. The women were the first to become skillful in baking. In the beginning, they used hot stones on which to lay a lump of meal or flour and water or the batter. Then, having learned about yeast, which rised the flour, that is, lifted it up with gases of bubbles, they made real bread and cakes and baked them in ovens which the men had made. When they put a slice of meat between the upper and lower layers of the bread, they called it broge. That is, a little bread or sandwich. In time, instead of one kind of bread or cake, they had dozens or 20 different sorts, besides griddle cakes and waffles. Now, when the wise men of the mark or neighborhood saw that the women did such wonderful things, they put their heads together and said to one another, "We are really ready to confess that fairies and elves and even the kabouters are smarter than we are. Our women also are certainly wonderful, but it will never do to let the boars think that they know more than we do. They did indeed teach us how to furrow, and the birds brought us the grain, but we are the greater, for we can hunt and kill the boars with our spears. Although they can tear up the soil and root in the ground with the Tuscan snouts, they cannot make cakes as our women can. So let's see if we cannot beat both the boar and the birds and even excel our women. We shall be more like the fairies if we invent something that will outshine them all." So they thought and planned, and little by little they made the plow. First it was a sharp stick in their hands, and the men scratched the surface of the ground into lines that were not very deep. They nailed plates of iron on these sticks. Next they fixed iron-shod wood in a frame to be pulled forward. By and by they added handles. Men and women harnessed together pulled the plow. Indeed, it was ages before they had oxen to do the heavy work for them. At least the perfect plow was seen. It had a knife in the front to cut the clods, a clodder, a beam, a mold board, and handles, after a while a wheel to keep it straight, and they said horses to draw it. Fro, the fairy, was the owner, not only of the boar with the golden bristles, but also of the lightning-like horse that could ride through fire and water with the speed of light. Fro also owned the magic ship, which could navigate both land and sea. It was very elastic, and it could be stretched out to carry a host of warriors over the sea to war, or fold up like a lady's handkerchief with a flying vessel. Fro was able to move about like a cloud, and also to change like them. He could also appear or disappear as he pleased in one place or another. By and by, the wild boars were all hunted to extinction and disappeared. Yet, in one way, and a glorious one also, their name and fame were kept in men's memories. Brave knights had the boar's head painted on their shields and coats of arms. When the faith of the Prince of Peace made wars less frequently, the temples in honor of Fro were deserted, but the Yule log and the revelers held to celebrate with the passing of the Mother Night in December, that is, the longest one of the year, were changed for the Christmas festival. Then again, the memory of man's teacher of the plow was still kept green, for the boar was remembered as the giver not only of nourishing meat, but the idea for men's brains, baked in the oven and made delightful to the appetite, served on the dish with its own savory odors, withal decorated with sprigs of rosemary. The boar's head was brought in for the great dinner with the singing of Christmas carol. And with that, it will end.